recall the last time we spoke about wages in general. Today, I want to talk about minimum wages. This is particularly important because Namibia's national minimum wage came into effect last year. We will look at whom the national minimum wage covers, how much is to be paid, and how it is supposed to work. To understand this better, I want you to know that the right of workers to receive fair wages is a part of the Namibian Constitution. The Constitution provides that in order to ensure the welfare of our people, the state should have laws that ensure that workers are paid a living wage adequate for the maintenance of a decent standard of living and the enjoyment of social and cultural amenities. This is a constitutional principle and goal. Now, effective 1st of January 2025, Namibia's basic conditions of employment guaranteed by the Labor Act includes the national minimum wage, which applies across almost all sectors. This is the first step in achieving the constitutional goal that I mentioned. Now, what exactly is a minimum wage? It's the lowest wage that the law permits an employer to pay an employee. It sets a floor, not a ceiling. The employers, of course, should pay more than the minimum wage to workers, but they are not allowed to pay less. The minimum wage applies regardless whether the contract is in writing or verbal. We talked about contracts and wages before. Whether the worker is full-time, part-time, or even casual or temporary, and whether the business is large or small. Now, you may ask, can workers and employers agree to less than the minimum wage? No, absolutely not. Any agreement below the minimum wage is invalid, even if the parties agreed and they thought they had good reasons to do so. The law protects the worker from unequal bargaining power, and employers will remain responsible. Even if they agreed to something less, they're responsible to pay what at least was the minimum wage. Therefore, paying below the minimum wage is unlawful. I will talk about exemptions later. There is the possibility of an exemption. Now, here's how the minimum wage applies. It's the amount that applies to the ordinary hours of work. It's the basic wage for the ordinary hour of work, or it's the floor for the basic wage of ordinary hours of work. I'll give you an example of the 45-hour work week. If you work 45 hours your normal work week is 45 hours, then you must be paid the national minimum wage for 45 hours. Now, this is the normal or ordinary hours of work. The minimum wage does not replace overtime. It doesn't replace payment for holidays or for working at night, or it doesn't replace allowances of any kind. These things are all separate and must be paid on top of the minimum wage. Some workers and employers are unsure about how the minimum wage applies to benefits like housing or food allowance or transport. They ask, can the employer deduct from the minimum wage the cost of these items? When it calculates the minimum wage, can it deduct them? No, this minimum wage is the cash amount, the dollar amount that must be paid. The other items that I mentioned are part of an employee's remuneration. They must be paid according to a contract of employment, but they are not a substitute for cash wages. Now, what if the employer and the employee agreed to a lower wage because the employer said, this is all I can afford, and the worker needed the job. Is that agreement valid? What if that agreement was entered into before the national minimum wage came into effect? The answer is no. The national minimum wage is the absolute floor for the payment of workers. And the law is there. There's been a long, long process to adopt this law, to effectuate the constitutional policy that I said, and to inject fairness, to prevent exploitation. Now, it's not, the minimum wage isn't a target, and as I said, it's not a maximum. Employers are certainly free to pay more, and if workers have a union, the union will definitely negotiate contracts above this, or if employers have been giving increases over the years, they'll get more than the minimum wage. It'll be added to their salary, but they cannot pay less. Now, these minimum wages not only protect workers from the worst forms of exploitation, but they also help to create competition, fair competition, because employers, if they compete with each other for tenders, for example, they shouldn't be allowed to compete on the basis that one can offer a lower price because they pay their workers less, all right? Now, let's talk about the concretes. How much is the national minimum wage? In general, it's $18 an hour, 18 Namibian dollars. There are a few exceptions that I will discuss shortly, but what does this translate into? If it's a 45-hour work week, the national minimum wage would be 810 Namibian dollars for that week. If it's a 40-hour week, what would that be? I'm doing the math. $732 a week. Now, per month, and the way you if you know what your weekly wage is and you want to know what your monthly wage is, you must multiply it by 4.33. So that's in the Labor Act, but I'm just telling you here. But the monthly minimum wage would be $3,577 for an employee who works 45 hours in a week. Now, the amount per day would be $144, and the amount that's for an 8-hour day. If it's a 9-hour day, it's $162. We'll show you some of these things on the screen. I think that'll be much easier, but I just wanted to let you know. Now, there are some minimum wages that in some categories of workers that have not reached this level yet, all right? When the minimum wage was introduced in January of 2025, it was announced that in certain categories where the wages have been historically low, the minimum wage will be phased in. What I mean by phased in is they'll be required to pay a certain amount. They were required to pay a certain amount in 2025. That amount goes up or went up on the 1st of January 2026. And by the 1st of January 2027, all of these categories will be up to the $18. The $18 amount is being phased in certain categories of workers where the wages were historically quite low, and it would have been maybe too big of a jump for employers to pay the minimum wage right away. So the phased-in sectors are domestic workers, where effective January 2025, the minimum wage was $12 an hour. Effective January 2026, which is where we are now, the minimum wage is $15 an hour. And January 2027, it will be $18 an hour. For farm workers started in 2025 at $10 an hour. The amount has gone up on the 1st of January of this year to 2026 to $14 an hour, and it will be $18 an hour as of January 1, 2027. And for security guards, they started with $13.50 in 2025. On January 2026, $16 an hour. That's what it should be now. And then $18 in 2027. Now, some of the common problems that I hear about is not everybody is aware of these minimum wages, which includes both workers and employers. That's one of the reasons. I'm sure the government is doing a lot to publicize them, but it's one of the reasons we're trying to publicize them too. Some small businesses may be struggling with affordability. Some employers of domestic workers may think that domestic workers aren't covered, but I can assure you they're covered by the minimum wage. In fact, there was a minimum wage for domestic workers that came in before the national minimum wage. And it's now been superseded by this one to bring them all into the same system. And maybe there's some confusion about how you do the calculations, all right? Now, I have no doubt that there are employers who are still paying what they were paying previously before the minimum wage came in. And I said, it may be ignorance, there may be other reasons. Now, what can a worker do if he or she is being paid below the national minimum wage? Well, if you're not sure what the minimum wage is, you can find out from the Ministry of Labor. That's the Ministry of Justice and Labor Relations. Or you can Google it. Just keep in mind the official amounts are an increase for the 3 years, but we're putting it on the screen here. Check your pay slips and the number of hours that you worked so you know how much you are owed. Be sure, as we have advised previously, keep records of your work. Keep the documents you've been given, but keep a record of how long you worked, how much and many hours you've worked. And if you're not being paid properly, raise the issue respectfully with your employer. All right? If you cannot work it out through respectful discussion, then you may contact a labor inspector at the Ministry of Justice and Labor Relations. There are labor inspectors in every region of the country. And I should tell you, the workers have a right to have been paid this minimum wage since January of 2025. That means if they can't resolve the issue, they may have to take it further to recover back pay. You can try to do it with the employer, try to do it with the labor inspector. If all else fails, a dispute could be referred to the labor commissioner. Now, what should employers be doing? Employers, please monitor the updates on the minimum wages. And please budget realistically. Your business model must take this into account. If you really think about and you do the math about what these minimum wages are, they're very modest. They are not what is called in the Constitution a living wage. They are a step in that direction. We cannot go below that. When you know there's going to be a change in the minimum wage, please adjust your payroll records and your contracts or your system promptly. And if you need guidance on what to do, you can get guidance through the Ministry of Labor too. Do it early. Now, I want to tell employers, there is provision in the law for exemption. In the Labor Act, there's provision for applying for an exemption from the national minimum wage. That's available to you to make that application. What is not available to you is to take the law into your own hands and not pay without an exemption. Now, I also want to mention that I learned that Cabinet gave a directive or made a decision to remind all the public entities that the basic conditions of employment must be adhered to for anybody to get a tender. And so any tenders that are being submitted to the tender board are being checked also to see whether the employer is complying with the national minimum wage. And I'm told that some have already been rejected. Some applications have been rejected on that basis. Now, remember what I said about equal competition, fair, level playing field? So that's not going to give someone an advantage. Now, if I can, I want to go back to something I saw in the newspaper, an older newspaper, after I talked about wages. You recall I said, if you have an obligation to pay wages, there's not an excuse. Now, I saw an excuse, I don't recall which public entity, but one public entity had not paid certain employees for 2 pay periods already because their authorization to issue pay instructions had expired. All right? That's a technicality having to do with whatever governance there is that doesn't excuse them. They can't take that out on their workers. If they didn't keep up to date, they still must pay them. And they'll try to solve that problem later. Now, on minimum wages, there's a simple message that I want to leave you with. No employer may pay a worker below the national minimum wage. Minimum wages support basic fairness at work. They are not optional, and they apply to everyone. When workers are paid at least the legal minimum, workplaces are fairer, more stable, and more productive. That's how minimum wages support both decent work and business success in Namibia. If you have any questions or wish to share your own experiences, or you're welcome to raise them here. You're also encouraged to let me know whether you have other topics you would like to discuss. My email address is shown on the screen. Also, please check out all of my podcasts on vacancies, Namibia, and Now a Zone. The next topic will be overtime and long working hours. Bye-bye. Thank you.